Welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and on podcast on all the major platforms. I'm Paul Smith. I'm one of the hosts of Food Farm Talk. The others are Emily Duncan and Abdul Rahim Abdullah. Today on Food Farm Talk on CFRU, we're talking to Brent Preston of Farmers for Climate Solutions. He's also a Simcoe County farmer and president of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. We're talking all about the different actions to engage farmers in mitigating and adapting to climate change, including many new federal programs that have been announced. So Farmers for Climate Solutions were instrumental in spurring that federal action. We're broadcasting here from the Treaty Lands of the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe Nation. And please follow the podcast and also our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook feeds. Last year, we had Brent on with Katie Ward to talk about the start of Farmers for Climate Solutions. And later, we had Karen Ross, who became director of Farmers for Climate Solutions. She was on talking about various activities, and Karen's now off on maternity leave with her new baby. I just heard from Brent. And so Brent is standing in for her in that role as director. So we're happy to have Brent here today. Brent? And to talk about the activities of Farmers for Climate Solutions and these brand new federal investments. So good morning, Brent.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
Yeah, maybe you can start talking by introducing yourself and a little bit about Farmers for Climate Solutions to remind the audience who you are and also who this group is and so on.
Sure. So I'm a farmer. My wife and I farm near Creemore, Ontario, which is about an hour and a half north of Guelph, northwest of Toronto. And we grow primarily cut salads for the restaurant and food service industry on our farm. But we've always had an interest in climate change and the ways in which farming can be a positive force in the fight against climate change on our farm. And we, about a year and a half ago, the organization that I'm president of, the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, came together with a number of other farm organizations across Canada to form Farmers for Climate Solutions. So our goal is to advocate for positive policy change that will lead to decreased greenhouse gas emissions and increased resilience in Canadian agriculture. And the coalition has grown a lot since we last talked. So we now have 23 member organizations, which together represent over 20,000 farmers from coast to coast in Canada. So we now have a critical mass of farmers who believe that agriculture must be part of the solution to climate change in Canada.
Cool. Yeah. And you've obviously had big effect. We had the revised federal climate plan back in late 2020, and then budget commitments in budget 2021 in March. And then they made announcements of various programs over the last year or so for new climate programs for agriculture. So the big new one that a lot of people talking is the 200 million on-farm climate action fund, and that's supposed to assist farmers with on-farm nitrogen management, cover cropping, and rotational grazing. And those are the exact actions that you folks proposed back in 2020. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the process that was followed to get that embedded in the budget and now in the program itself.
Sure. So I think the key to our success in lobbying for that new funding was that we took a very science-based approach. So we Farmers for Climate Solutions brought together what we called a task force of academic experts, greenhouse gas modelers, policy experts who understood the international policy context around climate and agriculture. And we actually crunched the numbers and figured out what are the on-farm practices that we know are going to lead to immediate mitigation benefits that are going to lead to immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that are going to make Canadian farms more resilient in the face of climate change. And we presented those findings to the government, and the government was very receptive to hear those kind of science-based, well-documented recommendations, and they eventually made their way into the federal budget. So we proposed $300 million in funding to kickstart emissions reduction in agriculture in the 2021 budget, and we got most of that, and the government directed funding to all the priorities that we identified. So I think what we've found when dealing with government officials at the federal and provincial level is that they're very, very receptive to a group of farmers who are coming forward with positive solutions, who want to work in cooperation with government, who want to support government, and that's reflected in the success that we've had with funding commitments.
Now, there's always an interplay between the political and the public service as well. So I know you had the Prime Minister's office, the Minister's office under Madame Bibeau, and then Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada officials.
Mm-hmm.
So was there a lot of, can you talk a little about the respective roles of those
Sure.
bits of the organization?
Yeah, I mean, we engaged with all of those people that you mentioned, with several different ministers directly at the federal level, with senior policy advisors in the sort of political offices of those ministers, and then the federal civil servants. And what we found is that there's in my opinion, there's a genuine commitment in the federal government at the political and the civil service level to finding ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. That the commitment to dealing with climate change seriously really is there, but there's a lot of competing proposals, and every sector of the Canadian economy has representatives who are trying to slow down climate change action, to be frank, and others who are trying to ensure that their sector gets a share of the federal money that's going to emissions reduction and mitigation. So what we had to do is prove the point that agriculture has really good, cost-effective opportunities for mitigation measures, and it was that scientific, evidence-based process that I think that won the day. And there were various times where we were dealing with elected officials or non-elected government officials who would have different ideas or different priorities, but in the end they were all, I guess, moved by the evidence that we presented, and they came together to support those priorities that we put forward.
Cool. So this On-Farm Climate Action Fund, it was created, in the end at least, as a group application-based program, so group supply for the funding. And so all those a bunch of the applications are into the feds now. And so what do you think about it being turned into this kind of group application process rather than a unified program that would be delivered directly to producers?
Well, we didn't anticipate that we would that's how the government would roll out the program. We had a whole bunch of meetings with federal officials to give them advice on program implementation once the funding was announced in the budget. We didn't anticipate that they were going to throw it open to a sort of open application process from different groups. And I think that some of that might have been motivated by the timing of the election, because the On-Farm Climate Action Fund was announced, a couple of days before the election was called. So I think that there's an element of the government trying to figure out just how to get these things rolled out as quickly as possible. Maybe in a perfect world, it would have been better for it to be rolled out as a single program that was administered by the government, or through a similar process that the that the Canadian Agricultural Partnership is cost share
Hmm.
programs are administered across the country. But we also see that there's a need for speed, that we don't have time to miss, 1 or 2 growing seasons while we figure out the absolute best way to deliver this money. So
Right.
we're hopeful that it's going to result in a good program that we can get rolling for next year's growing season.
Yeah, fair enough. So the funding for this on-farm climate action fund is currently only for 2 or 3 years to 2024,
Hmm.
and then in the meantime, we're working, or the feds and provinces are working on a new 5-year funding arrangement for agricultural policy that starts in 2023 and goes to 2028. So I guess one of the obvious questions is, should the funding, this climate action fund, be made permanent or at least embedded in that 5-year uh, funding arrangement as well, or even increased in that funding arrangement on an annual basis?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. The thing that at Farmers for Climate Solutions that we're most excited about the On-Farm Climate Action Fund is that it is um, designed to get money directly to producers to support them to change practice on their farms. So we think that this is the key to both adapting to climate change and to mitigating climate change, is to give producers the support they need to actually change on-farm practice. Uh, the this the money that we were advocating for in budget 2020 that ended up funding the on-farm climate action fund, the intention was always that this was going to be a bridge to the next agricultural policy framework that you mentioned, which launches in 2023. And that's the big prize in agriculture. That's the very large majority of public funding for agriculture in Canada flows through the agricultural policy framework, and something like $3 billion over 5 years. And that's a big chunk of the time we have left until 2030, when we have really important commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement to reduce our emissions. So we think that the kind of programming that we're seeing with the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, incentivizing producers to change practice, needs to be a really big part of the next agricultural policy framework. So I would like to see dramatically increase levels of funding, looking at the On-Farm Climate Action Fund as almost a pilot project to figure out the best way to deliver this kind of programming, and to really ramp it up in the next APF.
Well, building on the idea of the testing things out, so there's lots of challenges in the approach they've taken to the Climate Action Fund uh, with this group application process. So there's potential for different kinds of coverage across the country, or inconsistent delivery, or duplication of those sorts of things. So what do you think about the challenges this program will have in terms of those various projects going forward, as if you as you said, pilots?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you've for sure there's a danger that we're going to have overlap and duplication and confusion with the way this has been rolled out. The On-Farm Climate Action Fund is a two-part application, so it's only the first phase that has been that is closed right now. So we're hopeful that the government is going to look at all the applicants and pick groups that can work together, ensure that there's good coverage across the country, that there isn't a lot of overlap. Do things like create a common application process, so producers aren't picking and choosing from 4 or 5 different groups that they can get funding from to implement climate friendly practices on their farms. So I think that we still have a good possibility of a good national program that has good coverage and not a lot of overlap. But there's still work to be done before that is a reality over the next couple of months.
Yeah, fair
And
enough.
the federal election has thrown a wrench into this whole thing, because during the election period and this period of time when we don't have a minister appointed, federal civil servants are really limited in what they're allowed to do in terms of interacting with outside organizations. So we haven't been able to get any answers on when we're going to hear what the results are of this first phase of the On-Farm Climate Action Fund application. So hopefully next week, when the new cabinet's in, we'll be able to move forward quickly.
Yeah, that's right. So that the Climate Action Fund is one, and there are many other new climate programs in the federal government at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Natural Resources Canada. So there's all kinds of them, like the ones focused on living labs, the Clean Ag Technology Program, and then the Environment and Climate Changes one of Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund. So, and these are, at least that last one has potential for agriculture too, and it's again a group application process again. So, and these are all rolled out, and do they hang to? I guess the real question is, do these hang together? Are there missing pieces? The Feds seem to be very focused on mitigation and not on, building resilience, or and sometimes you can get, problems if you're not focused holistically on climate change writ large.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I'm not an expert on all these different programs, but I do think that there's a worry that it's the approach is a little bit scattershot right now. I think that again, there needs to be a balance between speed and efficiency. So I really think it's positive that the government is trying to roll out programs quickly, because we just don't have a lot of time to waste. We don't have a lot of time to mess around. I like the focus on mitigation. I think that our first priority, not just in agriculture but across the board, needs to be getting our emissions down as quickly as possible. But you're right that adaptation and building resilience is also really important. I'm hopeful that as time goes on, that the government is going to look at all these programs, see where they're having problems with overlap or gaps, and try to improve the sort of holistic nature that you talk about, or the ensure that we're really hitting all the marks that we need to hit. I think that the one thing that I come back to often in agriculture is that the kind of practices that we know are really good at emissions reduction are also tend to be really positive in terms of adaptation and resilience. So the practices that are being funded under the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, especially adaptive multi-paddock grazing or rotational grazing and cover cropping, these things we know are really good for reducing emissions, but they're also really good at making our soils and our farms more resilient to the kind of extreme weather events that we know are going to become more common. So that's one hopeful aspect of the approach in agriculture, is this pairing of adaptation and mitigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Feds are working on a adaptation plan as well, but it seems to be the poor sister following along behind.
Yeah.
So the other thing I was interested to see that Farmers for Climate Solutions, and you maybe can elaborate on the process, the task force and so on. I was interested to see that you're looking at proposals regarding business risk management programs and how they might be adapted to address the issues around climate change. And so maybe you can talk a bit about the process you're using and who's involved in that, and what you anticipate.
Sure. Yeah. So we're as we've turned our attention now really on the next agricultural policy framework that we talked about a little earlier, that will be launched in the spring of 2023, and the government process of negotiating and designing that program, or that partnership, is now in full swing. So the agricultural policy framework is jointly funded by the federal and provincial governments. So deciding on the priorities and the programs in that framework uh, is it's a process of negotiation between the feds and the provinces, and that has just started in the last month or so. So we have put forward as Farmers for Climate Solutions four high level priorities for the next agricultural policy framework that we've been talking to different levels of government about. But in developing more detailed recommendations, we're taking again putting together a task force of experts to come up with some of our policy recommendations. So the first one that we've done is around business risk management. So business risk management programs absorb something like 50 or 60% of all the money in the agricultural policy framework. So they're a big chunk of public spending on agriculture in programs like crop insurance and agri-stability, agri-invest. And we'd like to look at ways that those programs could be adapted to encourage or incentivize climate-friendly practices on farms. Right now, there's some anecdotal evidence that these programs don't really address climate risk, and that in some cases they actually incentivize practices that increase emissions or decrease resilience. So, for example, we hear lots of stories from farmers on the prairies who can't get crop insurance when they're intercropping, when they're growing two crops in the same field, which can be a really great practice for increasing resilience, increasing soil health, decreasing fertilizer requirements, all those sorts of things. But they can't get crop insurance when they do that. So we want to identify those areas that are incentivizing the wrong kind of practices and figure out ways that those programs can incentivize the right kind of practices. And then we'll pair that with another task force that's going to be a bit broader and look at all the other aspects of the agricultural policy framework beyond business risk management. So the BRM task force, we have representatives from the University of Guelph, University of Saskatchewan. We have academic experts who have been studying business risk management programs for a long time. And then we also have the Smart Prosperity Institute out of the University of Ottawa that's looking at international practice and practice in other jurisdictions outside of agriculture to see if there's lessons we can learn on how risk management can be adapted to address climate risk.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, I think, the reason the BRM programs are so big is because they're underwriting the entire farm economy. So they're legitimately very large.
Yeah.
I guess looking at other jurisdictions, it's interesting that the Biden administration has brought in some pretty interesting new little tweaks to their program. So they've done some of the things you're talking about. So those incentives, crop insurance reductions for when you have adopted practices, particularly cover crops, is
Yep.
what they worked on. So they brought that in. It was tried out in Iowa and Illinois, and they brought that in federally for this pandemic cover crop program. And then even more recently, they brought in kind of a BMP insurance idea for split application of nitrogen. So that, if you split your application of nitrogen, which is a good practice, and you're not able to put the second piece on during growing season, you can get crop insurance coverage for that sort of system, which is, and they've also dealt with the issues around cover crops. So it seems like the Americans have been leading the charge on this, and they have a lot of experimentation. And Canada had a little bit of that in PEI and a few other places, but we need more of that. But that, so how are you hoping that would be integrated into the next policy framework?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, those are exactly the kind of examples we're looking at in other jurisdictions to sort of get ideas of what we could do here. And I think, we have good homegrown examples, like you mentioned in PEI, has a long history of experimenting with crop insurance discounts and other incentives through risk management programs to incentivize good practice on farms. I think one of the key findings that we have has really come into focus for us during the budget process and this agricultural policy framework process is that we're a long way behind a lot of other jurisdictions when it comes to these kind of innovations. Not just the U.S., but in Europe, Australia, New Zealand. There's lots of jurisdictions that are spending a great deal more money than we are on climate adaptation and environmental programs generally in agriculture. And we've one of the big risks that we've identified is not just the risk of changing climate, but the risk of changing regulatory regimes and trade barriers as a result of these kinds of programs. So, for example, there are lots of jurisdictions that are now looking at carbon tariffs. So applying tariffs to imported goods that are coming from countries that are producing those goods with high greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon labeling is becoming more and more talked about, where the carbon the environment or the climate impact of the product is going to be printed right on the label. We know that agricultural supply chains are increasingly looking for ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and big agricultural companies are looking at ways to reduce emissions in their supply chains. So we see a big risk to Canadian agriculture if we don't catch up to these other jurisdictions, because our product, if our product is seen in the international markets as a high emissions product, it's going to be at a disadvantage in terms of regulations and in terms of customers who are going to be willing to buy it. So this is a risk that is in parallel to the the weather risks that we're seeing from agriculture, or the extreme weather risks, and something that we're really concerned about and think needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Yes. So before we close up, I think you made a good point about that your Farmers for Climate Solutions emphasizes that on a kind of a aggregate level, Canada spends far less in its agriculture spending on environment than other jurisdictions, particularly the U.S. and Europe.
Yep.
And nobody really knows that. That's not a commonly known fact, and that's an important thing. I think that listeners should know is that our spending is like orders of magnitude smaller than on a per farm or per acre basis. So so that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, we're not aware of anyone else who has sort of crunched all the numbers specifically on agri-environmental programming, but we found that even before these new programs that you've mentioned that the Biden administration is bringing in, the U.S. was already spending 13 times more per acre than Canada on environmental programs in agriculture, and the EU is something like 73 times more. So it's really a huge gulf, and it's going to have really negative trade implications in the future if we're not careful about it.
Yeah. Well, that's great, Brent. I really appreciate you coming on today, and we look forward to your further influence. I know there's a federal provincial ministers meeting sometime in the next few months when we get a federal minister in place, and so we'll see what happens with the next policy framework. So thanks a lot for coming on. Appreciate your time, taken away from other things, and so we look forward to hearing about your future work. And thanks to all the listeners on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph and on podcast. You can check out links in our show notes to some of the things we've been talking about today, and also on our social media feeds. So please tune in again for another episode of Food Farm Talk.